let's create a cylinder and make it really big. Alright, something like that. And create a material, call it fog. Get rid of the principal. Create a volume absorption as well as a volume scatter and add these together like that. Now create a geometry node and use the position input again. We're gonna use a separate XYZ and we're gonna use the Z dimension. Put that into a map range and flip these two final values. Alright. And we're gonna select the height region that contain the fog, like from 18 meters to 518 meters. We're gonna use a math node to control the density of the fog. Let's say 0.01 for now. And it's still too much. That's better, but still too much. Yeah, this is better. Create an RGB node to control the color of the fog. We're gonna use a somewhat blue fog, like so. Let me just lower the height a little more so that the tip of the mountain is kind of out of the fog. Alright, the fog is okay. We need to create the cloud next. So I'm gonna create a volume scatter node and I'm gonna use a mix shader to mix these together like that. The volume scatter should be to the second input. So here I'm gonna search for a fractal Voronoi texture. There we go. And I'm gonna use the the position as the texture coordinate. Again, create a color ramp node and have a look at the Voronoi. As you can see, it's a little too small, so let's set this to 200. Maybe it's still a little too small, but we'll come back here later. Let's say the levels should be set to 3 and reverse. Alright, this is gonna be the cloud layer. But before we turn these into clouds, we need to do some more work. Create a space warp node, set the strength to 2, the scale to be smaller, something very small, and increase the details a little. And the second level of warp, we need to increase the strength as well as the scale, and again set the details to something higher. And finally we have the third level of warping, and for this third level let's set this to 4 and increase the scale to be something very big, like that much. So as you can see, we have something that looks kind of like cloud, right? Now if we use this as the mask to select between these two shaders, we basically have a cloud texture. But as you can see, we have cloud pretty much everywhere and it's blocking the entire skylight away, which is not good. And we need to select just a layer to be the cloud and remove all the rest. So in order to select a layer and make it into the layer of cloud, let's go ahead and use the camera texture coordinate. Now let's use a texture coordinate and select the camera as the main object, and we're gonna calculate the distance of the render point to the camera. So we're gonna use the length. There we go. Copy this map range node, connect this to the value and select from 0 to, let's say, 4,000 meters. Swap these back to default and a float curve. Lower this a little bit. Next we're gonna add a math node and multiply this with maybe like 2000 for now. We're gonna come back here and tweak this number later. Alright, now we need to duplicate this node, and again we're gonna use the position, the Z dimension of the position to be more precise. So separate the XYZ and we're gonna use the Z dimension like here. We will use the map range node to select a height region, let's say from 500 to 1000. Create a mirror value node here, and we can lower the bias to set the brightest part to the bottom. If we multiply this with the cloud, we will basically get a layer of cloud here. However, as you can see, it's not looking very good. We're not taking the curvature of the Earth into consideration, and the cloud is perfectly flat on the sky, which is pretty bad like this. Toward the horizon, the cloud should be lower and lower like so because the curvature of the Earth. So to do that, we need to find a way to mimic the curvature of the Earth and force the cloud to be lower toward the horizon. And to do that, we will be using this group here. And actually, let's not use the camera texture coordinate. We will use the object texture coordinate instead. So I'm going to create a math node, and I'm going to add this together. And let's see. We are connecting the wrong input. So let's increase again. And as you can see, we have a slight curve on the cloud, and we can increase the radius of the curve by increasing this from max value here. And I need the lower part, the lowest part of the cloud to be below the horizon, something like that. Yeah, it's not really a curved Earth or anything. It's just fake, but it produced a pretty nice result. Okay, you can see we have some nice looking cloud going on, but yeah, we need to tweak the cloud some more. But first, let's go back here and go to the volume and lower these to 0.5 and increase this to maybe 4000 for 4096. If you want to move the cloud, you can actually add a vector math node here before the 3 warp, and you can just add or subtract the value to move the cloud. And I think the cloud needs to be even bigger. Now before we move on to add the trees, I want to add some background mountains in the far away part, because right now it seems like the landscape was cut off, because it was indeed cut off. So I'm gonna just Shift C to reset the cursor and add another plane. And this plane is gonna be the background. There we go. And for the background, I'm going to add another geometry node, and there we go, and connect it to the output. Alright, we have the exact same render mesh. So let me see, the camera is here, so I'm gonna move this background here. Alright, as you can see, the cloud seems to be falling down before the background mountain, which is not right. So let me just go back and change this distance here to something even further away, like 8000. And I'm gonna just scale this cylinder up a little so that it covers the entire 2 landscape. Now we seems to have this very faint line going on, and I think that's because of this value here. That's because the fog is cut off around that height level, so perhaps we should increase this fog cutoff a little. It's a lot nicer now. Now I think it's time we move on to add the trees. So let me just go back to the 3D viewport and reset the 3D cursor, and I'm gonna add another plane, and I'm gonna call this tree. Now I have this low poly pine here. It's just a pine with a bunch of green plane on top. Let's select the tree and go to geometry node. Now I'm gonna drop in the render mesh. Make sure it's relative, as well as the background also relative. Geometry join. Okay. Now before we can add the trees, let's go to the object tab and go to the viewport display, and be sure to set this to bound, otherwise when we add a lot of trees, our machine is going to freeze because of too much things to draw on the viewport. And also get rid of this show overlay thing. Now let's link in the tree and original. There we go. Now you can scatter the point onto the face right away and use a selection to select the faces that you want to scatter the points. But for large landscape, this will be very slow, so I don't recommend doing that. So before we can go ahead and scatter the points, we need to delete the unused faces. So let's get rid of this geometry because we don't need any of that. Get rid of that and also delete the group input. All right, now we need to first delete the rocks because we only grow the tree on top of the dirt. So naturally we need to delete the rocks. Input name attribute and it's gonna be debris. Okay, and we're gonna select a certain amount of debris to scatter the trees. So we will use a compare and less than or equal to something like that. If we have like less than 0.8 meters of debris or dirt, then we will delete it. So yeah, create a delete geometry node and delete the faces, and here we will delete the faces where the amount of dirt is less than 0.8 meters. Alright, let me just hide away the render mesh as well as the background and see what's going on. Alright, it's actually viewing as the bound, so let's set this back to solid. Let's have a look. Alright, so as you can see, we deleted a lot of geometry, but there is more. We need to delete more because right now we still have quite a lot. Now we don't need to grow a lot of trees on high slope, so the trees should only grow on lower slopes like this region and not grow on let's say this region. So we need to select a slope threshold as well. There we go, invert and select, let's say 25 degrees with a spread region of 10 degrees. Alright, now create a boolean math and use an or math and duplicate this compare node and use greater than. Compare this select slope with 0. Alright, and we will invert this. Not. Alright, we can set this to, let's say 15 degrees to delete a lot more geometries. Let's say 20, 25. It's about time we add the points on this surface. Let's just set the density to something lower and let's see. And I think 0.1 is still a little too much, but anyway, let me just use the slope angle to control the density as well. So create a math node and multiply this with 0.1 and use this to control the density of the points. And finally, it's time to scatter the trees. So instance on point, and this is going to be the point, and here we will put in our trees. And it appears that we put in the wrong object. It should be the pine tree, not the tree object. And my Blender freezes. Okay, let me just get rid of the overlay because this overlay is gonna slow down Blender quite a lot. The moment we get rid of the overlay, Blender just becomes fast again, but it's still very slow. So we need to use cycles to render. Okay, we have a little too many trees, so we need to lower the density to, let's say 0.25. Alright, that's a lot better. I think the trees are a little too big. Alright, here I'm going to drop a transform and I'm gonna lower this to 0.5 and I'm gonna create a random value. I'm gonna set this from, let's say 0.7 to 1.2 and connect this to the scale, and I'm gonna connect this rotation to this rotation here. Create a mix node and mix vector. Mix this rotation with 0 rotation, and let me just increase the debris threshold to, let's say 2 meters. Alright, let's see. I want to further control the trees, so I'm gonna create a map range node and connect this debris over. Select from 2 meters to 3 meters to set this from 0 to 1. Alright. And I'm gonna multiply this with the slope selection like that. Okay. Now I need to use the shore to remove some trees as well. So this would be shore. Okay. Now I'm gonna compare the shore value with a certain height level, like so. And I'm gonna create another OR Boolean node and connect the shore over, like so. But I think we need to set this to less than instead of greater than. Okay. Before we visualize the result, we need to get rid of the overlay and connect over. And I don't think we actually need to scatter the trees on the background mountains. So let me just get rid of that and use just the foreground mesh. Now we can go back to the material editor and fine-tune the material of the landscape. For example, we can let this green to grow out a little more. So we have a lot more grass on top of the dirt. And I just found out a problem with the render mesh and the water. Now the water has this ray cast that casts rays onto the render mesh, and the render mesh also raycast back onto the water. Now this is a problem because during render time Blender will only execute one of the two, so the other will appear to be wrong. Even though it's kind of work in the viewport, but it's not going to work during render time. So we need to fix this before we can hit F12 to render. So I'm gonna just rename this to water base. All right, and I'm gonna just turn off the modifiers for now. All right, next I'm gonna just create another mesh right at the position of the water mesh. This is gonna be water render. And this is geometry node 1. Let's just rename this to water raycast. There we go. And here we're gonna use that same modifier on this water render, but we're gonna modify this a little. Instead of using the geometry, we're gonna import this water mesh here. Okay, so this one is not gonna be rendered. And finally, we need to select the water base and get rid of this modifier. Now, the problem should be fixed because the looping raycast is gone. The render mesh raycast onto the water base and the water render raycast onto the render mesh. There is no more looping of the raycast or anything. And it should be safe to hit F12 to render. So I'm gonna hit F12 and render the image, and I'm gonna show you the result when it's done. Okay, that's it for the first tutorial of the World Blender series. I hope you managed to create something nice out of this. And for those of you who are wondering, the World Blender is available for sale on my Gumroad and Blender Market. I'll put the link in the description. Please check it out if you're interested in creating landscape right inside of Blender. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.